Hey, g'day and kia ora. My name is Justin Canty. I am originally from Australia. I'm currently living and working in New Zealand, and this is a segment of a project that I have recently finished that focused on the way that children talk about their experiences of using social media, and within that, bullying came out as a strong concern, and what became really interesting in the context of this was about how children went about defining what was bullying and also what was not bullying. So here we go. The problem that I encountered in the beginning research for this program, this is an inductive study, different from the some of the more quantitative-based studies that we've heard about already today. This is very much a qualitative study and starts with an examination of what I've called the conventional definition of bullying, the one that most of us are familiar with from the literature, which on examination is very adult-centric. And increasingly over the development of the literature over the last 4 or so decades, has focused heavily on behaviour solely and reduces a very complex phenomenon to a very simple and in some ways making it a little bit more manageable, but also resulting in the fact that perhaps it is too simplistic. One of the key problems that I encountered through this is that adult centrism has routinely marginalised children's own definitions in the context of how we as adults come to understand this phenomenon. One of the problems with setting bullying out there with this definition and treating it as turning it into a concept means that we've reified it, we've turned it into an abstract thing where it's situated, as we've heard in so many of these presentations, in a relational context. This creates a gloss over that relational context. When we stamp the word bullying over the top of all of the things that go on in peer interactions, and particularly troublesome ones, this means that we've precluded explication of those things. We've precluded getting into understanding where the similarities and differences and complexities are because we've put a label on them, as well as not really understanding how children themselves understand these interactions. So this study looked at 10 to 13-year-olds. This covers 2 year levels in the New Zealand schooling system. Some of the schools that I went into are these 2 year levels only. They're called intermediate schools, and some of them are what they call full primary, so from beginning of schooling years through to secondary schooling. The focus was how they accounted for using social media. That's what I went in and asked. What's it like to be your age and using social media? It was actually quite fascinating to talk with them about the fact that I couldn't know. So I went in as the naive adult because I was able to say, this didn't exist when I was your age. I can't know. Tell me about what it's like. And through a series of small group and whole class activities that would be similar to a social studies, values exploration kind of curriculum unit, I was able to co-produce with the participants a rich data set which was both audio and video recorded in the most part, and part of it included participants interviewing each other, no adults involved. I just wanted to get them talking with each other about what it was like to be using social media. Without me telling them that I was interested in bullying, I didn't bring up the B word. It came out from them, from which I could then ask, what do you mean by that? So the analytic methods that I used to take to that data included a cross-sectional analysis using constructivist grounded theory and investigation at key points within the data using finer grain analysis through ethnomethodology and conversation membership categorisation analysis. The point of using both of those two approaches was to be able to, as far as possible, bracket adult assumptions about what those children's knowledges were about their lives, because coming from a professional background in social work, I was bringing very much a person-centred and partly also inspired by liberation pedagogy, the concept that they were the experts in their own lives. And so it was from them that I sought to learn about where their understandings of these interactions was and how they made sense of them. So this was about meaning making. I wasn't looking at observing the interactions themselves, I was interested in how they made sense of them. So, one of the key quotes that came out of that initial investigation was from an ethnomethodologist who observed that socialisation glosses the interactions between adults and children and precludes their explication. So in the same way, it really became obvious that bullying, using the scare quotes, glosses interactions between children and precludes their explication, which I aimed to start redressing through this study. So what does bullying obscure? Part of what came out in those initial conversations between classmates, between peers, was a whole array, a vast range of different kinds of categories of activities. And it could include things like joking and play fighting and bullying and being mean and being made fun of and copying and dramas and name calling. And as they very sagely informed me at one particular discussion, this means screwing around. And one of the interesting things was that some of these interactions could be playful. Some of these interactions could potentially be categorised as bullying, but not consistently, not always, and that there were other factors that were involved which meant that they could be or they couldn't be. So what came out of this was these collections of categories. There were potentially troublesome actions, troublesome at many levels. So it could mean troublesome for the interlocutors, the people who were involved in the interaction. It could be troublesome from an observer, whether that's a peer observer or an adult observer. And they potentially could be bullying. They could also be not bullying. They could be just for fun, or they could be being serious. And these collections did include permeable and overlapping boundaries, that activities potentially fitted into many or even all of these different collections at different times, depending on what was going on in that specific situation. And the participants oriented strongly to the difficulties of interpretation and how you go about deciding whether an action was bullying or not, whether it was hurtful or not. So action was definitely necessary, as a part of distinguishing bullying from other activities. And there were a range of actions that were troublesome. One of the categories that came out, mocking, I checked out really carefully because I thought I had an idea of what it meant, but I wasn't entirely sure about what they meant. So they were able to talk to mocking in terms of probably similar to a dictionary definition, so copying, making fun of, but this could be a playful activity and not always being mean. And so as a category, that then becomes troublesome because some people said it's always mean, it's always serious, and other participants from the same school would say, nah, so sometimes that can just be between friends and playing around. And so, as I was saying, interpreting an interaction was also troublesome. And this was a particular concern in relation to adult observers. And in relation to social media, there was a strong sense that adults were a bit silly about social media and didn't really understand how it works and don't understand how friends talk with each other in particular. So that the risk of misunderstanding, the risk of misinterpretation was a very strong theme around what came out of these data. So action was definitely necessary. You can't have bullying without an action. There has to be something going on. However, participants also consistently presented that it was not sufficient. You couldn't simply look at a behaviour and say that's bullying or that's not bullying. So one of the concepts from conversation analysis and membership categorisation analysis, a foundational concept is this idea of recipient response. So intent actually was pretty much nowhere in terms of how the participants in this study determined whether something was bullying or not. Their response was, it depends how the other person takes it. And so it's the response of the other person that determines, in their definitions of bullying, whether something could be determined as bullying or not. So this is the concept of adjacency pairs. When we do a thing, very often there's a response that we expect. If we offer a greeting, we expect a greeting in response. If we create something that looks like a question, we usually expect there to be an answer. And similarly, in a play setting, Marjorie Goodwin's work showed that in play sequences, very often children will give a directive, you be the mother. And so they will expect a response as part of that. This came out strongly in the data, and one of the things that Harold Garfinkel talked about in terms of members of a society, members of an interaction, was that we're all practical sociologists. We're looking at and interpreting what's going on around us all the time. And it was very evident that in this orientation to recipient response, these groups of 10 to 13-year-olds were doing lay conversation analysis. They were looking at what was going on and they were observing what the response was and saying that's what matters in terms of defining what's bullying. What comes up next is some excerpts from transcripts of the data. The presentation of these is in the conversation analysis style, so it's done in a particular typeface, and you'll see various dots and squiggles all over the place that mark pauses and emphasis and things like that, and overlap in talk. What I've pulled out are examples of where participants in this study are orienting to this concept of recipient response as key to determining whether something can be bullying or not bullying. So what we see here are children grappling with the same interpretation issues that adults do, with comparable sophistication, I would say, about how to interpret actions. And they clearly include talk, and talk on social media as an action. And co-constructing the meaning of that interaction. One of the extracts that's not produced here was included a concept of failed cyberbullying. So they came up with a candidate definition of bullying that was being mean to someone online, and so with a question, what if the other person treats it as a joke? Then it's failed cyberbullying. So it really is how the person on the other end, how they have reacted to it, how it affects them, that is the important thing. And so this offers some more examples of how it affects the other person is the important thing. And some people can take it seriously and some people can take it as a joke. So within this, around what parties are orienting to, demonstrated how relational context matters and what the context of the interlocutors were. It wasn't just simply that, you know, they were talking to each other. Knownness was important to knowing how to determine whether to take something as a joke, whether that's how that person usually is, was facilitated that process of interpretation. So random people, not really sure whether they mean that seriously or that it's meant as a joke. For people that I know, it was a simpler process, an easier process, that familiarity meant that someone knew how that person usually is, to determine whether something could be interpreted as joking or serious. And this is consistent with a lot of the things that we already understand about how teasing works to strengthen friendships and close relationships, as well as in a harmful sense. Interestingly, I'll say participants freely shifted between online and in-person contexts to draw parallels, which was consistent with a lot of the things that have already been talked about in this thing. There was no distinction made, and they would freely offer examples from one context or another to clarify what they meant by a particular term or not. So if you know them was a key way to make a difference in terms of how to interpret that interaction. That interpretation by the recipient was also identified as potentially problematic, and the potential familiarity or knownness, the pivotal role of familiarity or knownness was important for interpretation. And so what you can see in Eddie's comment here, that she was really strong on saying that most people will know me and know if I said something bad, they probably know it's a joke. And she was a person who presented her self-concept as someone who would often say a lot of sarcastic things, and the more sarcastic that she was, the more she liked you. And that, you know, you come across this with people that if they're polite to you, they probably don't know you very well, but the more joking and mean that they get with you, the more sarcastic that they will be with each other. And so play fighting or screwing around, as one group of participants explained, the context of doing funny stuff between declared friends offered a way of understanding that relational context was the key to influencing interpretation, not only by the interlocutors or participants in the interaction, and therefore this is what was important for an observer to make a valid interpretation of the interaction. Participants also noted the problems associated with observer interpretation and the fact that sometimes interlocutors or observers may also underestimate the impact of the negative impact of an interaction. So, they were alert to these problems as well. So, friends came out as a specific relational category, and within the developmental age for this particular age group, we can see friends as a category is shifting from people that I know, that everyone in my class is a friend, through to people that I have specific and close relationships with. And particularly, friends came out important to be able to say that something wasn't bullying. So friends might fight, there might be negative things that happen between friends, but that doesn't fit in the category of bullying. And so, something might look bad as an interaction between friends, but if you see a joking response, then it can mean that they're just being friendly. So there was a specific salience of friends to recipient and observer interpretation in terms of how these participants were going about defining bullying as a practical and applied process. Friends supports the idea that superficially hurtful actions can be interpreted as joking, teases as relationship strengthening devices, but again, as I said, the second larger extract there does bring us back to recipient response, that you cannot categorise an activity solely by the action or perceived or interpreted intent. So where we ended up, this really showed strongly that these adult-generated constructs were what in some contexts you would call a thin description. They weren't really very satisfactory. They didn't bring out the richness in the vast array of different categories available to describe and account for troublesome interactions. And so these functional definitions from which emerge an interactional and interpretive model for defining bullying as an interaction and understanding it within interaction set forward strongly that it is complex, it's irreducible, and as a de-reified category, it's one among many words that we can use to describe these kinds of troublesome interactions. And the difficulty from an adult perspective is that the more we limit categories, this impoverishes any explication of children's experiences. Sure, bullying came out of a context wanting to look at extreme cases and focus on abnormality. It does raise questions about do we ditch bullying, but it still has currency in children's accounting for interactions. But the important thing was it's not the sole category that they use, and anything that we as adults do to help them with troublesome interactions is limited if we are not listening effectively to how children will categorise these interactions, because there are lots of reasons we know from other studies why children may resist calling something bullying. And the more that we insist on calling things bullying, we risk that we won't get a chance to intervene with what we're actually concerned about, which is hurtful and harmful interactions between peers. And so, to finish up, what came out of this study the most strongly was that children are knowledgeable about their experiences, and as adults, we haven't been very good at listening, asking to children about what they mean by bullying, or finding what they think is troublesome, and then truly listening to the answers, and we should do it more.